You know, in India and Pakistan, they had family planning, the federal government imposed. But, you know, it was the 70s to control the population. But the religion played a huge role in stopping that. Because in Islam, you know, you are not supposed to do any of this. You know, it's God creation, whatever happens. I'm surprised that the churches here, the Catholic Church and others, did not play the same role. Or maybe they did, but never really heard the voice. What do you think the role of the Catholic Church?
Well, they were the hugest opponents to, one of the hugest opponents, besides sort of, at least outside of the scientific and medical communities. Right. And I mean, they were definitely a voice. But I mean, at least in the Protestant communities and Lutheran, that was not necessarily an aspect. But definitely the Catholic, I mean, they came out and really were definitely opponents to that. And even when you use, even in my news articles and stuff like that. But the people that were the people that I sort of reviewed, at least for the advocates of sterilization, they were predominantly of like Lutheran and Protestant backgrounds. But I do know that was definitely a voice that was in contention with it.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Well, I just think I could see this being important, or really important, like 20 years from now, just because I remember 10 years ago we were celebrating the 6 billionth person in the world, or it might even been less, and now we're on the 7th already, and this could be a very different conversation in the future. And I was just curious if you would see a revisit on something like this, just because most of Western Civ, it's pretty much stagnated population, but as all the developing countries come up, I mean, Africa has tripled in population in the last 50 years, and Asia is going off the charts, and South America is going off the charts. I mean, all these countries are getting huge, and there's got to be some conversation going on about that.
There is. There is, and that, I mean, that's why, you know, the UN has sort of commissions on population, as well as, you know, in the United States and everything else like that. And one of the things that, you know, I'm at least doing preliminary research sort of, you know, is in China and sort of India, sort of covered a little bit. And in China, you know, the one-child policy, there's definitely issues in sort of countries that have the largest population, just for understanding what does it mean for resources, what does it mean for actually just being able to live in the countries. In China, the one-child policy was enacted nationwide in 1981, and I know sort of a government official said that they were going to continue this policy up in, you know, for another 50 years until 2050. They were trying to get their targeted goal down to like 1.6 billion, I think, and this was, you know, when this issue was stated. Yeah. And I know, I mean, and that's something that the international community has scrutinized and criticized China, and some have actually, like, you know, at least heralded them, because I think in 1998, Columbia University sort of issued a sort of estimate that, like, from their program's inception until then, like 200 million fewer Chinese you know, children have been born because of that, and so it's effective, but also very, very coercive, or, you know, coercive. I know, at least in China, if you cannot have a child outside of wedlock, so it immediately has to get aborted. At least in the cities and the urban areas, I think it really is. You can only have one child, and then maybe if you pay a fine, you can have two. In the rural areas, it's much more, I think, lenient to 2 to 3, but. And so it just actually recently in 2007, NPR came out with a news article about forced abortions in the Southwest provinces because they haven't met their targeted goal. And so you're having families that, you know, really can only just have one child now. And so, again, this is a debate, this is a conversation that is really, really happening. And that's why in the beginning, when you talk about, well, what is this, you know, what do you do? When does the state have the right? Especially when it goes into sort of global issues, not just sort of even state or personal. And then that gets into conversations of versus individual rights versus global and community rights. I do know in 1994, though, forced sterilization was put on sort of as for one of the UN conferences with women. I mean, they put that on the sort of agenda that was something that you cannot do, and that was a universal, human right. So there's definitely conversations, but I don't have, I mean, and that's something that I don't know if anyone has really been able to come up with something that people don't have contingent over.
But sorry, I was just thinking,
Yeah.
they've thought of lots of different ways, just haven't been able to put it in place, like water in the air
Sure,
and
yeah.
other
Oh.
Mars or the moon or whatever the case may be. We've never been able to actually go through with any of them.
It's interesting you mentioned China. There's on NPR not too long ago there was I guess it could be considered anecdotal, but how the one child in urban settings has changed their social structure, in that this is a very patriarchal society that very much you want to have a boy. The son is what gets all the money and attention and effort goes into them. Well, now, because urban families can only have one child, if they have a daughter, the daughter's the one that gets the education, the money to go do whatever she wants. And so now we're seeing a lot of girls going to college, and suddenly there's this birth of this really Chinese princess type. I mean, these women who would not have had any of these luxuries from their family that now, because of their own child, are getting. So,
well, another flip side too is that, like, if for a lot of them, if you're going to do infanticides for the girls and you're only going to have males, then what is that actually, the gender demographic, and what does that actually mean for the continuation and the evolution? I mean, if you only have a predominance of males,
that's
actually
been in India right now.
Yeah, and there's
all these boys and women.
No, there's an interesting book, I haven't read it yet, but it's sitting on my desk, called Unnatural Selection, and it's really about this sort of issue between what happens when you have majority men, and like what does that mean for marriage and stuff like that.
Power.
In power, yeah.
Power. Suddenly you don't have the powerless class anymore. You have only men. They're all supposed to be equally powerful, but that doesn't happen. So, interesting dynamic.
Any final questions?
There was one thing that I wrote down that I thought was interesting. One, you had said something about that when they sterilize them, they consider them the feeble-minded no longer a threat.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something about the political side of this, the uncomfortableness. And I wondered if this was all just oh my God, I don't know how to handle these retarded people. Let's just sterilize them so they don't have any kids, so we don't have any more to deal with. Because, I mean, there's been plenty of situations where people don't know how to handle someone who is mentally retarded or somebody who may have physical abnormalities. We get very uncomfortable with that that's just the way we are. And was that sort of a political move in that respect to kind of...
At least when I dealt with feeble-mindedness or sort of the mental defectives in Iowa, feeble-mindedness was a catch-all term. It was really quite, it really did deal with sexual deviancy, and so your social behavior really attributed to whether or not they thought you were feeble-minded. You didn't necessarily have to have an IQ. There definitely was sort of IQ ranges that sort of fell into. But at least in Iowa, one of the big movements, and that could definitely be sort of an uncomfortableness, but it was also and I came across some cases of sort of extreme mental disability, or at least maybe perceived. One of my women who was sterilized, she used her baby as a pillow and never cared for her child, and so I think social welfare workers brought her in. And so you could see in this, even though she said that she didn't want to be sterilized and there was this whole issue of sort of abortion, the social welfare workers as well as the psychologists were like, well, you can't take care of your child. And so there really is this contention that a lot of some of the social welfare workers were saying when they dealt with sort of the population of feeble-minded is, can they handle the responsibilities of parenthood? And the danger to that, though, is that they generalized a population and really denied a lot of individuals sort of that right. And so that was definitely a part, I think, of the agenda, was this concern